It took an extra 38 days, but New York State finally has a budget. This fourth budget of the Kathy Hochul era includes much of what the governor wanted: criminal justice changes, a bell-to-bell ban on cell phones in schools, and inflation rebate checks, among other provisions. So, Luke, what do you like, what don't you like about New York's $254 billion budget?
Well, one thing that stood out to me was education, and I think this has been a priority for Governor Hochul throughout her tenure. We saw an increase in education funding overall and with formula aid, and we saw changes to how that aid is calculated, which if you spent time in schools or working with school districts, you know it's a big mess, a complicated system, and they were using data that was 20 years old from the 2000 census. So they changed that, and so they'll be better able to capture what districts need the most aid. One thing I don't like are the implementation of regulations on private schools. We had 10 years of trying to make sure that particularly New York City schools of the religious nature were fulfilling state competency, and we've seen that implementation now delayed several more years, and that's going to hurt kids.
And that's the equivalency standards for the curriculum across
exactly.
schools.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would say in addition to Luke's comment is that if you step back and look at this budget as a whole, it's very much a common sense budget that's dealing with the kinds of issues that are concerning to the voters of New York. In addition to the education, it's also putting money in the pockets of taxpayers. Now, it's not a lot, but it's essentially sending the signal that government is there to serve the people and not the other way around. Some of the other things that struck me were some of the improvements to prison reform that's been a hot button issue in New York State, and more specifically the requirement that prison guards not just wear body cameras, but that they have them on at all times while they're on duty. Then in addition to that, I really like the idea of closing more prisons because crime is down. And then finally, ensuring that there are inspections of facilities on an annual basis to see what's going on. So I think, you know, they got it right in terms of their focus. What's not there is support for immigrants. We didn't see a renewal of the $1 billion for asylum seekers, and that's sending, I think, also a signal.
Aaron, we did see $1 billion for the climate fund.
We did see $1 billion for climate, but I'm going to say I was pretty disappointed, and it's pretty clear that Governor Hochul has moved back from some of her promises and aggressive action on this defining crisis of our time. There is $1 billion in there. There's $200 million of that going to neighborhood district heating initiatives, which are really exciting. A lot of it is for shovel-ready projects. But what you don't see is support for the New York Heat Act, which is really essential to move our state away from fossil fuels. And you also don't see any progress on this cap and invest system that's been promised and is being slow-walked. Now, I agree with Nina that there's sort of a common sense attitude towards this budget. But one of the things I think that is a misread of this personally is that she's walking back from her commitments on climate, and ultimately that's going to hurt our state's energy transition.
Well, she's certainly positioned herself as a moderate and looking ahead, I'm sure.
I think the one going to education, there is the bell-to-bell of getting rid of cell phones. I think we're starting to see in the country guardrails for social media that will continue for the next probably 10, 20 years as we're doing that. I like that. I like the free breakfast and lunch, which I think is important for kids. What I don't like, what I don't see coming is, I think, one of the greatest problems in New York State, which is housing. We've got to be able to build more housing, or we're going to continue to lose population. Right now, it looks like we're going to lose 4 seats in the 2030 census, and until we fix housing, that's just going to continue. And I don't see anything major that's going to do that, particularly zoning reform just didn't happen in this bill.
Well, she's proposed ways to deal with housing in the past, and the NIMBY issue comes up. People don't want to
Long Island NIMBY issue happens every time, but if New York doesn't get this right, it's just going to continue to hemorrhage population.
So,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, on top of that are the looming federal cuts to social services, which I think are going to hit the housing industry particularly hard. What I'd say, though, in defense of both the governor and the legislature, is that they did give the governor authority to make other adjustments to spending should that become necessary.
And that's with an eye on the federal budget and perhaps changes to Medicaid and the way Medicaid is funded, right? That we may end up having to shovel a lot more money in that direction.
And affordability is clearly a focus for Hochul as she pursues reelection, which you referenced. I didn't think the rebate checks were a great idea. That seemed kind of gimmicky to me. I mean, a couple $100s. I mean, how's that really going to help people long term? Not that it's not a significant amount of money, but I don't really see that moving the needle. I would rather see more substantive policy.
What about the process of getting the budget done? It used to be called 3 men in a room. It's not 3 men in a room anymore, but it still seems to be 3 people in a room.
Yeah, I would say more like 1 woman in a room this time around. I mean, it's a very much executive-centric budget process, and that the legislature, once the governor sends her proposal, can only make so many changes. But the worst part to me is that lawmakers only have a few days to pour through hundreds of pages and hundreds of millions of dollars to make the right decision.
What about criminal justice? I mean, you alluded, or you mentioned, Nina, the changes in the prison system, corrections things. One of the things that struck me was corrections officers now can be 18 years old, which just seems awfully young to be in that position. But there have been changes to the discovery process as well, and that was a big deal for the governor.
Yeah, it was a big deal for the governor, and if you listen closely to her presentation of the budget that was adopted, you'd think she won on that. But in fact, there were compromises by way of expanding what's the definition of due diligence, meaning that it's not enough for prosecutors to just say that we did due diligence, to turn over all of the information. But judges can now look at that and look more specifically at the volume of evidence that may be coming later, and then potentially start the speedy trial clock all over again.
So to make sure that the defense attorneys have that same information, know what the evidence is.
And enough time to look at it.
Mm-hmm.